Many talented people of color were snubbed in major categories. Unfortunately, there's nothing we can do about that. The Hollywood Foreign Press are all very, very racist. Ricky Gervais stood at the Golden Globes podium in January of 2020, looked directly at 200 of the most powerful people in Hollywood, and told them he knew what they had been doing. Not with the nervous energy of someone taking a calculated risk. With the specific calm of someone who had already decided the consequences did not matter and had made peace with that decision before he walked onto the stage. The room went silent. Not the polite silence of an audience waiting for the setup to resolve into a punchline. The other kind. The silence that arrives when the thing being said is not funny and everyone in the room knows it and nobody is quite sure what to do with their face. 5 years later, the United States Department of Justice released the documents that confirmed every single thing he said that night. But here is what almost nobody has connected publicly in any sustained way. The same week those files dropped, Wendy Williams was locked inside a facility she was describing to anyone who would listen as a prison she had not chosen and could not leave. And Ellen DeGeneres had quietly relocated to another country and was giving interviews about feeling unfairly targeted. 3 stories, 3 different people, 3 different positions inside and adjacent to the same industry. One thread running through all of them that the industry spent years developing sophisticated mechanisms to keep buried. The night the room forgot to pretend. Ricky Gervais had hosted the Golden Globes 4 times before 2020. Each time he had pushed a little further into the territory the room would have preferred he avoid, tested a little more of the tolerance the industry maintained for self-directed criticism delivered in a controlled and ultimately harmless format, and watched the machinery absorb the discomfort and return to its baseline the following morning as if nothing had been said. The machine was good at that. It had been good at that for decades. By his 5th hosting appearance, he had decided the performance of politeness was no longer worth the effort of maintaining it. He walked onto the stage at the Beverly Hilton with a beer in his hand, the beer itself a signal about how seriously he intended to take the evening's conventions, and opened by announcing to the room that he did not care anymore. It was a big year for pedophile movies. Surviving are Kelly, Leaving Neverland, 2 Popes. Shut up. Shut up. I don't care. I don't care. That line got a laugh. What came next did not. He moved through the monologue with the deliberate pacing of someone working from a list rather than improvising, covering each target with the efficiency of someone who had prepared thoroughly and intended to finish what he started regardless of the room's response. He addressed Felicity Huffman and the college admissions scandal that had recently sent her to prison, brief and pointed. He went after the streaming companies with specific corporate names attached. He turned to the audience and told them directly that the corporations they represented in their acceptance speeches, the ones whose logos they thanked and whose values they proclaimed, were so comprehensively morally compromised that they would sign business agreements with virtually anyone regardless of what that person had done or been credibly accused of doing. Each observation landed with incrementally more weight than the one before it. The room was becoming uncomfortable in the particular way a room becomes uncomfortable when it realizes it is not being invited to laugh at someone else, but is itself the subject of the material. Then he said the name Jeffrey Epstein. He told the audience that many of the people sitting in front of him had been passengers on Epstein's private aircraft. He told them they were fully aware of who else had been on those flights and what those flights represented in the context of what Epstein had been charged with, and what he had died in custody before being convicted of. And he said, with the camera rolling and an audience estimated at 200 million people watching from their homes, that he was aware they had all been friends with Epstein. The camera operator, following standard broadcast instinct, found Tom Hanks in the crowd. The expression on Hanks's face had moved considerably past discomfort into something that did not have a clean name. Nobody laughed. Several people found the floor more interesting than the stage. A few people looked at each other in the sidelong way that people look at each other when they want confirmation that someone else is also witnessing what they are witnessing. A joke that produces complete silence in a room professionally populated by entertainers trained to generate and respond to laughter is not a failed joke. It is a mirror being held up to a room that does not enjoy its own reflection. Epstein had died in his Manhattan detention cell 5 months before that evening, in August of 2019. The official medical examiner's determination was that he had died by suicide through hanging. Forensic pathologists retained independently by his family disputed that determination in public and in significant anatomical detail, citing physical evidence they described as more consistent with homicide than self-inflicted death. The federal documents connecting Epstein and his associate Ghislaine Maxwell to individuals across the entertainment industry, the financial sector, and the political world were still 5 years away from public release at the moment Gervais was standing at that podium. He was delivering a monologue in January of 2020 that read, when those documents finally became available in 2025, like an outline of their contents. The question that nobody at the time asked with sufficient persistence was a simple one. How did he already know with enough confidence to say it on live television? What Gervais understood that the audience was performing ignorance about. After that night, Gervais was never again invited to host the Golden Globes. He has confirmed this in multiple subsequent interviews with the absence of visible regret or resentment, treating the outcome as the entirely predictable consequence of a deliberate choice rather than as an injustice worth dwelling on. He has also said something in those interviews that is more revealing than any individual joke from the monologue itself. He said he was not performing for the 200 people occupying the seats in that ballroom. He was performing for the 200 million people watching from their living rooms and kitchens and bedrooms, people who did not have access to private aircraft, who had not received award from the organizations being satirized, who did not possess the particular and well-documented immunity from consequence that sufficient wealth and industry centrality tends to provide over time. He described his function that evening through a specific historical framework that he has returned to in multiple interviews. In the British comic tradition, he explained, the stand-up comedian operates as a court jester. The jester's singular function, the only job the role exists to perform, is to say out loud in the presence of the powerful what everyone in the room already privately knows and what nobody with material interests at stake will commit to saying openly. He was not presenting this as an act of personal courage. He was describing a structural mechanism that has existed across centuries of political satire. The jester can say the thing without consequence because the jester has nothing that the people being addressed can credibly threaten to take away. His income did not depend on Hollywood. His creative output did not require Hollywood's cooperation or permission. His audience existed independently of any relationship with the people sitting in that ballroom. The cost of honesty was therefore calculable and acceptable in a way it simply was not for people whose professional existence was embedded within the system being criticized. He continued producing and releasing material after that January evening. He continued addressing the same subjects in interviews and in subsequent creative work. And then in 2025, the Department of Justice released the Epstein documents in a series of tranches that collectively ran to thousands of pages. Flight logs with names attached. Financial records documenting the movement of money through Epstein's network. Email communications between Maxwell and individuals across multiple industries that documented the nature of relationships the parties involved had previously denied or minimized. The documents confirmed connections that had existed publicly only as rumors, as accusations made without institutional backing, or as the kind of statements Ricky Gervais had made from a stage at an award ceremony. The jokes had been a reasonably accurate structural outline of what the documents contained. Gervais noted this in a subsequent interview with the particular flatness of someone describing a prediction that came true and finding no pleasure in the accuracy. He said he had genuinely preferred to be wrong. He had been hoping the room would laugh, because laughter would have meant the premise was absurd. The silence had meant something else. Now hold that specific thought. Because while Gervais was watching a federal document release confirm what he had said from a hotel ballroom stage 5 years earlier, something was happening 3,000 miles away to a woman who had been making similar statements from a different platform for 30 years. And unlike Gervais, who had structured his professional life so that the costs of honesty were survivable, she was in no position to comment on any of it. The loudest voice in daytime television and what it cost her. Today about former talk show host Wendy Williams. New court documents filed by her legal guardian say she is now permanently incapacitated by her ongoing health battles. Wendy Williams built her entire professional identity around saying precisely what the entertainment industry had developed a collective and largely unspoken agreement not to say. She began in radio in New York in the 1990s at a period when certain figures in the music industry had achieved a status that functioned as practical immunity from public criticism. Not because the criticism was factually unsupported, but because the web of business relationships, financial interdependencies, and professional connections surrounding those figures made criticism professionally dangerous for anyone whose livelihood was connected to the same industry. Williams named them anyway. She named them with the casual directness of someone who had either not received or had deliberately declined to absorb the industry's implicit instructions about which subjects were acceptable for public discussion. In 1998, while working as a radio personality at Hot 97 in New York, she made on-air statements about prominent figures in the music industry that resulted in her termination from that position. She addressed this directly in a 2006 conversation with Howard Stern, confirming without apparent ambiguity that her commentary about powerful industry figures was connected to why the station ended her employment there. The station itself never publicly acknowledged the relationship between what she said and why she was let go. It did not need to. The mechanism does not require formal documentation to function. The pattern was visible to anyone paying attention, and Williams understood it completely. Say certain names identify certain behaviors, make certain connections audible to a public audience, and lose the platform through which you were saying them. She lost that platform and constructed another, then another. The process of losing platforms and rebuilding them gave her an increasingly clear map of where the lines were and an increasingly clear sense of how far past them she was willing to go. By the time the Wendy Williams show launched on syndicated television in 2008, she had spent a decade demonstrating through repeated experience that she could not be managed through the conventional mechanisms the industry typically deployed against people who said inconvenient things. She had been terminated. She had been threatened in ways she described in detail to her own audience. She had faced pressures she documented publicly rather than absorbing privately. She described an incident during her show's run in which a guest she had previously named publicly appeared on her program and referenced her teenage son by name in a way that she later said she understood unambiguously as a warning. The camera captured the change in her expression at the moment the boy's name was said. She spoke about that moment on multiple subsequent occasions and was direct about what she understood it to mean. She continued talking anyway. For 14 seasons, she continued talking. And when the entertainment industry's carefully managed surfaces began cracking visibly in 2020, she was the only host occupying a major daytime platform who said publicly and without qualification that Ellen DeGeneres maintained a significantly different private reality than the one her show was selling to 11 million daily viewers. Ellen DeGeneres and the brand that operated for 19 years on a single repeated instruction. Ellen DeGeneres closed every single episode of her program with the same directive addressed to the audience. Be kind to one another. For 19 consecutive years, that phrase functioned as the load-bearing wall of an image worth hundreds of millions of dollars in brand value, merchandise revenue, endorsement agreements, and the specific commercial premium attached to being understood by a mass audience as a fundamentally good person. The phrase appeared on merchandise sold through the show's official channels. It was quoted in profile interviews as evidence of what the host genuinely believed and consistently embodied. It was the thing journalists reached for when they needed a shorthand description of what the show represented and why it had sustained the audience it had for as long as it had. It was across nearly 2 decades of consistent deployment, remarkably effective at the function it was serving. In July of 2020, BuzzFeed News published an investigation drawing on accounts from dozens of former employees and production staff members who had worked across multiple departments and multiple years of the show's production history. The workplace environment they described did not share recognizable features with the image the daily closing instruction was constructing. Former staff described an environment where senior producers engaged in conduct ranging from consistent dismissiveness toward employees to active hostility. Multiple accounts referenced a standing informal instruction that staff members were not to make direct eye contact with DeGeneres. Complaints about workplace conditions were described as unwelcome rather than addressed. The culture that had developed around the host was characterized by multiple independent sources as built on the management of fear rather than the expression of the warmth being packaged and sold to the viewing audience daily. Warner Media opened a formal internal investigation following the publication of the BuzzFeed report. 3 of the show's senior executive producers were removed from their positions as a result of that investigation. DeGeneres addressed the situation during the premiere of her subsequent season, acknowledging on air that things had occurred on her show that should not have occurred. She framed the acknowledgement in terms that attributed the problems to the behavior of others rather than to the culture she had presided over. She announced the show's conclusion in May of 2021. The final episode aired in May of 2022 and was attended by an extended celebrity tribute sequence in which major figures from the entertainment industry offered warm send-offs. Wendy Williams was conspicuously absent from those tributes. The absence was communicative in the way that a deliberate silence is always communicative. DeGeneres relocated to the United Kingdom following the show's end. She stated publicly that she had no plans to return to the United States in the near term. In a subsequent interview, she said she felt she had been made into a target and that the criticism directed at her had exceeded what was proportionate to what had actually occurred. The people who had spent years working in her production offered accounts of proportionality that arrived at different conclusions. The people who had described the internal workplace environment that the formal investigation had substantiated enough to result in the removal of 3 senior producers had a different framework for assessing what constituted a fair response to what had been documented. Something in this story remains unresolved, and the resolution is complicated by the fact that the person most directly relevant to it is not available to discuss it publicly. Because Wendy Williams is not available to discuss it, she is not available to discuss anything publicly in any sustained way. She is living in a facility she cannot exit without authorization. In a legal arrangement, she is actively contesting in court under a diagnosis an independent medical professional has directly disputed. The conservatorship and the questions it raises. In May of 2022, the same calendar year, the Wendy Williams show concluded its final season. Wells Fargo Bank filed a communication with a New York court stating that it had developed concerns about Williams's capacity to manage her own financial affairs. Williams was 61 years old at the time of that filing. A court-appointed guardian named Sabrina Morrissey was subsequently given authority over Williams's financial accounts and over significant aspects of her daily life and movements. Williams was not present at the proceeding through which that arrangement was established. Her former husband, Kevin Hunter, subsequently filed legal documents contending that the guardianship had been created through a closed proceeding that had denied Williams a meaningful opportunity to obtain adequate legal representation before the arrangement was formalized. In 2023, Williams received a diagnosis of frontotemporal dementia and aphasia, a diagnosis that was used to support the ongoing guardianship arrangement and to justify the level of control being exercised over her circumstances. In November of 2024, her court-appointed guardian filed documents with the court characterizing Williams as permanently incapacitated. In January of 2025, Williams called into the Breakfast Club radio program, a medium she had worked in for decades and understood how to use, and said directly that she did not believe she was cognitively impaired. She said she felt she was living in captivity. She described being isolated from people she wanted to communicate with. She described the living environment she was in as one she had not chosen and had not agreed to. She told the Good Day New York program that she had submitted to independent competency assessments and had completed them successfully. A neurologist who had no professional connection to her existing medical team reviewed her case and issued a conclusion that directly contradicted the frontotemporal dementia diagnosis that had been used as the clinical foundation for the guardianship. Her legal team initiated appeals proceedings based on that independent evaluation. In March of 2025, personnel from the New York Police Department arrived at her assisted living facility and transported her to a hospital. Williams addressed this publicly afterward and stated that she had received no advance notice that it was going to occur. Members of the public organized protests in Los Angeles and New York calling for the conservatorship to be dissolved. Kevin Hunter filed a civil lawsuit seeking $250 million against the parties overseeing the guardianship arrangement, alleging that the mechanism established to protect Williams had been converted into an instrument used against her. Williams communicated through TMZ that she had not requested Hunter to file that lawsuit and did not want him involved in the management of her personal affairs. The guardianship remains legally in place. The competing medical evaluations have not been resolved through the court proceedings. And the woman who spent 30 years operating as the most direct public voice in an industry that rewarded indirection is currently residing in a facility she cannot voluntarily exit, in a legal arrangement she is actively fighting to terminate. At the precise historical moment when the things she spent her career saying are being confirmed by federal document releases and legal proceedings, she is not free to publicly comment on. A documentary about her situation produced by Lifetime aired during this period and generated sufficient public attention that her guardian's legal team was compelled to address it in court filings, characterizing it as a distorted and inaccurate representation of her circumstances. Members of Williams's family described the same documentary as the most accurate public account of her situation that had yet been produced. Two diametrically opposed characterizations of a single film submitted to the same court about the same woman who was not permitted to speak freely on her own behalf about any of it. The timing proves nothing on its own, but it is the specific kind of timing that, once registered, creates a question that is difficult to set aside. The files, the exits, and what 5 years confirmed. When the Department of Justice released the Epstein documents across 2025, the entertainment industry's response was notable for two specific qualities: its speed and its quietness. Hollywood talent agent Casey Wasserman, whose personal email exchanges with Epstein associate Ghislaine Maxwell were contained within the released documents, announced he was divesting from his talent agency within weeks of the first major document release. In the communication he distributed to his staff explaining the decision, he described himself as having become a distraction to the business. He did not provide elaboration on what specifically he was a distraction from or why the distraction had materialized at that particular moment. Several additional figures whose names appeared in the release documents announced professional transitions, retirements, significantly reduced public profiles, or changes in their stated professional activities during the months that followed the releases. None of these announcements were accompanied by explanations that addressed the timing directly. The documents themselves assembled a picture across thousands of pages that confirmed documented connections rather than rumored ones. Flight logs contained names. Financial records documented the movement of money. Email communications between Maxwell and individuals across multiple industries demonstrated the specific character of relationships that the individuals involved had publicly characterized very differently when those relationships had been raised previously. The picture that emerged from the documentation was not experienced as a revelation by people who had been paying sustained attention to what certain figures had been saying in public for years about what they believed to be true. It was experienced as confirmation. Gervais noted in a subsequent interview that the monologue he had delivered 5 years earlier at the Beverly Hilton had essentially documented itself through the release of federal records. He noted this without celebration or satisfaction. He said it in the register of someone describing the worst possible version of being right about something. Wendy Williams was not available to respond to any of it. She was still residing inside a legal guardianship she was contesting, still characterized by her own court-appointed guardian as permanently incapacitated, still evaluated by an independent neurologist as not presenting with a condition used to justify placing her under that arrangement. The woman who had spent 3 decades being the most audible voice in environments where silence was professionally rewarded was, at the precise historical moment when the federal government was confirming what she had been saying, structurally prevented from saying anything at all. Among the names appearing in the released flight logs were figures from the music industry, from the film industry and from the financial sector. Several of those figures had been named by Williams on her program during its 14-season broadcast run. The episodes in which she named them are still accessible. The dates on which those episodes aired are documented. What she said, about whom she said it, and when she said it, constitute a matter of public record that now exists in the same searchable landscape as the federal documents released 5 years after Gervais addressed the same subject from a stage. The Sean Combs civil litigation, which by the relevant period included more than 100 separate filings from individuals alleging various forms of misconduct, was also moving through the courts during the same window in which the Epstein documents were being released and processed publicly. Several of those filings referenced events and locations that Williams had discussed publicly on her show during years when no legal proceedings had yet been initiated. She was not named in those filings. She was simply, as a factual matter, earlier than the legal system in identifying the subject as worth discussing. What the silence in that room in 2020 actually meant. 3 people, 3 positions in and adjacent to the same industry. 3 outcomes that diverged in ways that reflect with considerable precision the different structural circumstances each of them occupied when they made their choices. Gervais spoke from independence. His income, his audience, his creative output, and his professional future did not depend on the goodwill or the continued cooperation of the people he was addressing from that stage. He lost a hosting engagement he had already performed 5 times. He retained everything else. The cost was proportionate to his position. Williams spoke from inside the system. Her show, her income, her public platform, and the daily logistics of her professional and personal life were embedded within the same ecosystem she was naming publicly. The cost she paid was not the loss of an invitation to a recurring hosting engagement. It was the loss of a show, the loss of financial autonomy, and the imposition of a legal arrangement that has functioned to prevent her from speaking publicly during the period when speaking publicly would have been most consequential. DeGeneres occupied the 3rd position, which was structurally distinct from both of the others. She was not someone who had been naming things publicly. She was someone whose carefully maintained public image had been functioning to conceal things for a sustained period. When the concealment became unsustainable through the publication of employee accounts and the formal investigation that followed, she did not attempt to address the situation from within the industry. She left the country. She relocated to the United Kingdom. She has characterized what happened to her as disproportionate criticism. The people who worked within her production and provided the accounts that triggered the formal investigation have characterized the events differently. What the 5 years between January 2020 and the Epstein document releases accomplished through the accumulated weight of federal records, court filings, civil lawsuits, independent medical evaluations, and the legal proceedings surrounding Wendy Williams was the reduction of the distance between what was being said and what could be formally documented. Flight logs naming passengers are not the same category of evidence as comedy monologues naming friends. Court filings documenting workplace misconduct are not the same category of statement as a daytime television host describing a colleague's dark side. Emails between associates demonstrating the nature of relationships are not the same category of assertion as jokes at an awards ceremony that die in a room of 200 professionals. The documentation arrived. The industry that had spent years developing the mechanisms to manage the conversation that certain people were trying to have is now engaged in managing something that documentation makes considerably harder to contain. Gervais is not hosting the Golden Globes. Wendy Williams is inside a legal arrangement she is fighting in court. Ellen DeGeneres is in the United Kingdom. The files are still being read, and the proceedings are still continuing. If Wendy Williams had never been placed under a guardianship, what do you think she would be saying right now about all of it? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found value in this, smash the like button, subscribe for more untold Hollywood stories, and hit the bell so you never miss a new release. Thanks for watching.